Thank you very much, Nem. And yeah, I hope everybody can hear me. IAGP from the very beginning, I think, has been unusual in combining natural and social science expertise in its work programme. And in fact, in 2010, when the project began, or just before the project began, I think there was plenty of philosophical and stakeholder comment on climate engineering, but almost no social science evidence of how various publics, and I say that in the plural, I'll come back to that at various points, constructed, thought about, would reason about, or frame issues around geoengineering. And that was rather different to other upstream topics like biotechnology and nanotechnology, which have got a reasonably long history of research from social sciences. So there's a sense in which there was a completely large and gaping hole in the literature sitting there when we started the research. So there's a sense in which actually it's not been entirely filled yet, but we think we've made some progress in meeting it. So at Cardiff we set out with the following two goals, which I won't read out, really with the objective of contributing early, or as it's been phrased ever since Wilsden and Willis's seminal report and the Royal Society's report on nanotechnology of about 10 years ago, upstream social intelligence on public responses with the anticipation of actually informing the governance and responsible innovation processes for climate engineering. So we're not just doing that. As a social scientist, as broadly a psychologist, social psychologist, I am interested in how the various publics are constructing this question from my scientific perspective, but it's done because we feel, those of us who do this kind of work, that there is some benefit to the governance process. The ethical considerations, just to step back to that, we were aware of a range of social and ethical concerns, and in a paper actually completed partly in response to the Royal Society's, how should we say it? Steve and I have discussed this at some length before, slightly technical discussion of ethics, I think that would be fair to say. There was quite a rich set of literature out there that had been boiling up over the previous 10 years or so. And so Adam Corner and I put this kind of together as a rough view of what it looked like, and there were issues of intentionality, of unintended consequences, consent, all of these ones that many of you in the room will have debated over the years. The transboundary issues around legality and security. The moral hazard hypothesis, I state hypothesis because it's interesting, and I'll come back to that, was there. So the idea that if you provide people a quick fix, in the way that you might provide insurance for flooding, then people would not then protect themselves against the risk. And whether we are constructing a new technology by actually doing research on it. And then finally, the point I'll come back to, which wasn't in our original discussion, but the question of messing with nature. So I'd been involved in the discussions in Oxford, as Steve mentioned, on the Oxford principles. It's fair to point out that this list did not come out. We did not just sit down in a room and decide in an afternoon or the morning that this is what should happen. We were drawing it in our own fields upon a range of discussions around other technologies that have occurred over a number of years. So if you look in the risk communication literature, you look in the science and technology studies literature, at point 2, which is the one I guess that I'm addressing in this research stream, public participation is not a new idea at all. In fact, you can trace it back to Habermas and his discussions of democracy and deliberative democracy. But in those literatures, for at least 30 years, we've had public participation as a key plank within engagement around new technology and technology assessment. What did we actually find? Well, picking out 3 core findings, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the more detailed things that might be interesting. And if you think these are obvious, then again think about the gap in the research literature. 5 years ago, we might have said they were obvious, but there was no evidence for them, which is always the kind of the social scientist response to this is all very obvious. But without the evidence, you can't state what is obvious and true and what is obvious and clearly untrue. So in terms of both the later research we did and the research we did, I'll talk about for the SPICE testbed stage gate, it was clear that when we talked to members of the public and give them information about geoengineering, framed in a relatively, neutral is the wrong word, but to show the various framings that are involved in this. Properly controlled research was not ruled out. That's been absolutely clear from pretty well everybody. Nobody has kind of stood there and said, no, you should not do this. And the opposite in a way. People, once the climate problem is described to them in its seriousness, that without necessarily phrasing a climate emergency frame, people say, well, you scientists, actually you guys should be getting on with this. You know, the right people should be working on this, and within limits, why not have research? But, and the key but is there's a core ambivalence underneath all of this, that there were significant concerns about actually doing it, scaling up or deployment, especially for solar geoengineering, but not necessarily only for solar geoengineering. So that's the first key finding. The second one is that messing with nature, we would have predicted this from work on biotech. Those of us who did work on biotechnology, public perception of biotechnology risks, messing with nature has always been something that came up in surveys as a core predictor of concern and risk perception. And as with this one, you would have thought, maybe messing with nature will be important. I was involved with the experiment Earth public dialogue that was held at about the time of the sandpit, just after the Royal Society's report. And there it was, and one of their conclusions was that the public participants brought up geoengineering. Some aspects of, some deployments of geoengineering would be more natural than others, and that messing with nature was a key issue. Our comment on that was that, unfortunately, for all the strengths of that, because it was the first time this had been done, some of the participants had introduced the messing with nature or the natural versus unnatural frame very early on in the dialogue process. And therefore, you couldn't tell whether what you were getting out was a result of the initial framing that had been placed in by some of the expert participants who were party to that, no names mentioned, who were party to that public engagement exercise, which otherwise, science-wise and ran very effectively. So we needed to follow that up and find out whether it really was something that people would bring spontaneously to a discussion of geoengineering and framing. And I've got no clear evidence for moral hazard. I'll qualify that a little bit towards the end. Although this may depend upon individual prior views on climate change and the world views of how to deal with the environment. And I'll get on to what I mean by that in a second. Just to unpack those in a bit more detail, Hugh's already talked about the SPICE testbed. What we did, we were asked very early on by NERC and EPSRC to conduct public engagement, by which I mean engagement with average members of the public, not with stakeholders, who would be the people in environmental NGOs, in business, in government regulatory agencies, people who had an agenda interest in the question. So we were selecting entirely randomly unengaged citizens in the same way as you would engage a jury to decide upon guilt or not. The workshops took about 2 days. It's reported in an article in Nature Climate Change. And when the testbed and solar radiation management over this period were described to people as we went along, people were very thoughtful. They were measured. They raised some really, really interesting questions, which we reported on elsewhere for the research team and for the stage gate, effectively. Some fairly straightforward ones on methodology, safety, communications. So effectively, people were saying, well, subject to safeguards on some of these issues, or these issues, we'd probably let the test go ahead. We don't see that's a question. But then what was interesting, the final two bullet points, people raised much tougher questions about what could be learned from the testbed and how any full-scale deployment might actually be governed. So this was the wider set of issues. It was interesting, actually. People were very pleased to be consulted. They thought it should happen as routine, and we weren't saying that to them. They, at the end, said, was this a good idea to input into the stage gate? But some of them were actually quite uncomfortable about it. People will have heard me say this point, that somebody actually, in the workshops towards the end, said, but look, so you're going to pass on what we said to the NERC and EPSRC people, and they might actually either let this thing go ahead or not as a result of what we've said. So we said, yes, that's right. but if then somebody was killed as a result of that decision, would somebody come back and sue us? Which is really, I mean, that's a very insightful comment. We said, no, that's fine. It's all completely anonymous. So they might sue us, but they won't sue you. So that was all reported to the Stagegate panel. And actually, again, in the discussion of the spice test bed, it's often said it was cancelled because of public outcry. Now, our public did not outcry. They said, actually, subject to certain conditions being put in place, it could go ahead. In fact, actually, at the Stagegate, broadly, those conditions have been met by the risk assessment and other things that have been put in place. So it's kind of interesting in the telling of that cancellation that it was seen as public pressure that did it, but actually the broad public probably would have thought it was okay. Other members of the publics in the engaged groups were much more agitated about it. And Matt said very early on today that maybe they should have engaged those groups very early on, right at the start of the process. And I would fully endorse that. I mean, I think there was always the view that a twin-track approach with what are called the engaged and the unengaged publics should have been followed. And that was just one of the things of the process that maybe could have been improved. A second key finding, messing with nature. Alongside the view, having done the SPICE workshops, then the following year we ran a further series of in-depth workshops, more broadly looking at geoengineering, CDR and CRM, carbon dioxide removal and radiation management more generally. And this time we were very careful not to put the natural analogies in early into the workshops. We wanted to see if they came up spontaneously, and they did. So that was fine. Alongside the view that geoengineering was second best to mitigation, which we've heard already, it helps to explain why, as with some biotechnology applications, some people might hold particularly ambivalent attitudes about it, certain forms of geoengineering. But as with all topics with climate engineering, life is not as simple as it first seems. So biochar would be seen as natural, mirrors in space are not, but then what about reflective crops? Are they natural or not? So you can have a debate about that. In fact, it was very interesting because the whole debate in the workshops about climate engineering sort of served as a form of negative test, a projective test. It elicited a whole range of responses about the way humans interact with what people thought of as natural. And I don't want to go into it in great detail, but there were various different, quite subtle differences in relation to what people thought nature was. I mean, actually, it's interesting that final one, Regenesis of Nature, that one of the themes that came up in the workshops was not that we're unnecessarily or catastrophically going to destabilize nature, which comes up earlier, but then actually, well, geoengineering wasn't actually like cloning. People thought, well, because it probably would act with the main planetary natural systems, there wasn't anything particularly unnatural about it, which was interesting. We didn't actually anticipate that would come up. Towards the end of the programme of research, we hadn't put this in the original proposal, but our advisory panel and I think EPSERC encouraged us to do this. We did one or two more experimental studies, and in one of them we wanted to explore the moral hazard argument, the idea that the availability of a solution to climate change might distract from mitigation. And again, the results are quite complicated, and there's a paper that has just been published in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions, which you can read. But the key conclusion was it depends upon who you ask. So we know that the public broadly splits into, there's quite a small group, but a vocal group who are quite sceptical about climate change and climate science. And they also tend to have values which, in a way, believe nature is robust to interference with it. And it was certainly the case that those people thought that the availability of geoengineering would affect their behaviour. This is a self-report. Obviously, we don't know how people would fully behave in the future. They certainly felt it would affect their behaviour. Interestingly, people who had the reverse values, who were much more concerned about climate change, believed it was happening, had more nature disbalance, cultural worldviews, didn't think it would affect their behaviour, but felt it would affect others, and it would certainly affect politicians' behaviours. So there are an interesting set of views out there which are differentiated by a prior view on climate change. finally, which is why I'm showing this slide, just to show you a little bit of data, we also, and I hope it's probably not entirely clear, but there's an interesting little difference here. This was a question, the prospect of geoengineering makes you think that the risks of climate change are worse than I thought. So this is what we called, it was brought up in Steve's report, or the report that the Royal Society published, that maybe the prospect of geoengineering would galvanize some people to think that climate change was actually an issue that they hadn't thought of before. And the interesting thing is is the sign here that these two things are both the two statistically significant effects regressed upon this question, so predictors of, and one was the skepticism score and one was the self-enhancing values score. And remember I said a minute or two ago that you tend to get both of those together. So people who are skeptical about climate change, my time is over, also tend to have self-enhancing values. But there's a negative sign here, which is very interesting, that it was the climate skeptics who rejected that statement, but people who had self-enhancing values, who are individualists in cultural theory terms, actually endorsed that statement. So there was a more complicated pattern going on there. And others have noticed this. This is theoretically important because it suggests from one of the first times thinking about new technologies and cultural beliefs, there's a dissociation between skepticism and self-enhancing values. And that's important from a theoretical perspective. So finally, recommendations. Public and other stakeholder perspectives should continue to play a prominent role in responsible innovation. Policymakers should consider, among both public and other stakeholder audiences, that there's this strong preference for mitigation. That was clear in all of the work we did. Geoengineering approach is seen by most as a sticking plaster rather than a solution, and that applies both for solar radiation management and for other ways of doing it. And I think finally, we've always thought this, but more so, certainly our public groups endorse this as well. Why should we just have this conversation here in the UK or in the West? We should expand this conversation about responsible innovation and its impacts to communities in other countries who might be more severely affected by any geoengineering proposal were it to go ahead. Thank you.